Hi, I'm Montana Yorke, and I'm joined today by the one and only John Williams, founder of Shadow Stats. John, thank you for being here.
Montana, thank you for having me.
Anytime, John. John, I know you have your own way of calculating true inflation. Would you mind walking my listeners and viewers through your data process?
Sure. I'm an economist by trade. Started off with the regular numbers that everyone else does, published by the government. But I was working on this back in the 1980s, some 40 years ago, I guess, at this point. And the federal government, U.S. government, decided to change the way it calculated inflation. The idea was to lower the headline inflation, change the methodology so that there'd be less inflation reported, and that would reduce cost of living adjustments to people on our Social Security. And that would save the government with its in its deficit, trying to keep the deficit down. I thought that was terribly offensive to the American people, and I certainly found it offensive to my own senses. Mm-hmm. The Consumer Price Index, as it is in the United States, was and is defined still as the cost of living of maintaining a constant standard of living. That's the way it had been for many years. People were used to it. But in 1982, the first thing they hit was the housing cost, the cost of owning your own home. And that was really the biggest, and still is today, the biggest portion of the CPI. But what they did is, instead of using normal costs tied to owning a house, the government decided it would determine what a homeowner would rent a house to himself for. And they call that homeowner's equivalent rent. Mm-hmm. And then how much a homeowner would raise the rent on himself each month. And that was the monthly inflation charge. Absolute nonsense, had no relationship to reality. The U.S. government, however, when it does things like this, does make note of what they're doing, and they also estimate the effect of what they're doing. In this particular case, their estimate of the change was that it would knock 1.5 percentage point off the aggregate CPI, not just the housing component, the aggregate CPI, biggest portion of it. Mm-hmm. And so as they went along, and they made a number of changes in the CPI up until the mid-2000s. Each time they'd make a change, I'd reverse engineer and put it back in, much the way, so the people would see what the CPI was as they had gotten used to it. And right now, there's roughly a 8-9% percentage point differential. I mean, if you look at the headline CPI, and indeed domestic inflation is rising here with all the problems tied to the pandemic and the Russian-Ukrainian crisis. If you look at the latest number, the latest Consumer Price Index number, headline number from the government, for February 2022 was up 7.9% from the year before. That was a 40-year high. My estimate's up at 16%, which is a 75% year high. Takes you back to right after World War II. I'll bet on my number anytime against the government's, and let me tell you why. I did not do this up front. It took me a while to actually do it, but my index, I kept it a common base with the headline CPI back in the 1980-1982 period. But as it went along, my index started to part ways with the government's. Governments was going like this. Mine started going like this exponentially. And that was the effect of how they had changed things, because where they did estimate the changes are cumulative. I mean, each year, instead of going back and measuring the actual cost of housing, they'd understate it by a significant amount. And what happened over time, my index just kept getting higher and higher, and the other kept getting higher, but not quite as badly, not as exponentially. So that at one point I figured I'd plotted against the price of gold, and much to my shock, it pretty much matched the price of gold, and I didn't even have to change the scale. The reason behind that is at the time, the current consumer price index, as it's measured, is based on a period I think it's 1982 to 1984 equals 100. And if you go back to the time when Richard Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard, which was 1971, the CPI at that time was about 78, 79. And that happened to be the price of gold at the time, which is the $78, $79 range. So that going forward, the price of gold in dollars and the level of the inflation index sort of moved together. But after the government started making the changes, gold kept moving the way it was, and went exponentially, along with my numbers, is very close over time. I can take my annual average and come up with a rough estimate of where gold is, and this is well after the fact that the numbers separated, I'll contend that what I'm seeing in headline inflation is a lot closer to underlying reality. The problem is it's getting worse. It's going to get a lot worse. And the reasons behind it are not the ones that are being touted by the Fed.
And when you say it's about to get a lot worse, John, what are your forecasts for 2022 and as far as inflation is concerned?
Well, right now it's a lot worse than the government was saying, or the Fed was saying it was going to get. What the Fed has done is they've just flooded the system with liquidity, with money supply. Unprecedented. If you look at the most liquid measure, and the Fed gimmicked their numbers in terms of changing the definition of M1, which is the narrowest measure of the money supply. They redefined it so that it was 90% of what was their broadest measurement too. But I took the most liquid measures of it, cash and demand deposits, and you have this type of crisis. People flee to cash. You see the flight to liquidity. And that's what we've seen here. And if you look at what I call the basic M1, which is the original M1, just cash and checking accounts, which is what generates where you see the liquidity flow and which generates the inflation. This is right now we're up something like 110% from the pre-pandemic level, the pre-pandemic trough, and when the Fed started just pumping the stuff in the system. That's effectively unprecedented. That's what's creating the inflation. It's not a strong economy. The economy is it's overstated in terms of a lot of what comes out of the government for some of the same reasons that you see the gimmicks that were put into the CPI. They're big gimmicks that were put into the GDP. Two benefits of understating inflation under the federal government. Number one is that it reduces cost of living adjustments and payments that you have to make in terms of trying to compensate for inflation. Mm-hmm. If it's understated, you're paying out less. If you look at economic growth is usually expressed in terms net of inflation, so that when you have the headline gross domestic product, although that will be expressed in current dollars, actual dollars as they are today for comparison purposes, usually those numbers will be deflated for inflation so that you can look at the numbers comparably over time, net of inflation. And if you understate inflation, you overstate growth, the real growth. Mm-hmm. So you have stronger numbers and you have weaker adjustment to people's income. It's a net negative all the way around in terms of credibility and what's actually happening out there. It is. You look at that with the GDP. The headline GDP is recovered. It's not recovered by much, but when I say recovered, the definition of recovery there is regaining and now going above the pre-recession, or in this case pre-pandemic peak. The GDP, gross domestic product, has done that, but payroll employment has not. Now, payroll employment is as broad an economic indicator as you'll find, and it's honestly reported because it's based on tax filings by businesses. It's not being surveyed by the Bureau of Labor Statistics per se, like they do with the unemployment, go out and talk with people, or say go out and survey the consumer price index. Right now, that's very difficult because they can't do what they usually do. They don't have people out in the field because of COVID. Mm-hmm. So you're not getting real good quality numbers. As far as I can see, the payroll employment is as good a quality statistic that's out there. Right now, it's shy by 1.4%. recovering its pre-pandemic peak. And putting that in perspective, although that might not sound particularly bad, particularly where you were down more than 10.5% at one point with the initial collapse, that's still at a level that if you go back historically and look at it at U.S. inflation, U.S. recessions, that's as bad as a recession trough. It's worse. Where we are now, right now, is still worse than the 1980 recession in terms of the level of the pandemic. And if you look at it across industries, the payrolls are not supporting the headline retail sales or manufacturing or even construction. So it's there's a lot to be desired here in the quality of the numbers right now. Part of the problem right now is the government just can't survey the way it did. Part of the problem is the government has happy ways that it does sometimes work its numbers to keep a smile on everyone's face.
Right. And speaking about putting smiles on people's faces, is there any sign of a deflation, do you think, John, or are we steady headed on the up curve through 2022?
I'm not seeing anything that's being done that's going to contain the inflation. Mm-hmm. Raising interest rates will not do it. And that's what you have to keep in mind is that the U.S. Federal Reserve is owned by our banking system. The banks own the Fed. They control the Fed. They'd like to have higher interest rates. And if you have a normal economy just booming along, usually you'll have strong economic growth, and that'll be generating the inflation. So by raising rates, and you have a strong economy, you can bring the pace of economic growth down some. That will indeed help lower the recession. That's the theory that they're working on. The problem is that the inflation is not only being driven by money supply, which is not being affected by the interest rate, it's also being driven by shortages and other pandemic disruptions. So that right now that you have an extreme overdemand, and raising interest rates is not going to bring down inflation. It's going to hurt the economy, and down the road you're going to see an even weaker economy. But I'm looking for inflation here to continue rising, and potentially it could get out of control. You could have a hyperinflation. We're getting very close to that dangerous point. And there's one reason to consider here, something to look at going forward. Again, normally we talk with most economists and say, well, gee, if you have a rapid turnover in the money supply, the GDP to money supply ratio, that's generally a good sign for the economy. You're generating a lot of economic growth on top of the money supply, and with that you're getting the inflation. That's considered inflation. When you have a high velocity of money, that's considered to be, which is the term that's used, that's generally a sign for positive inflation. I say positive upside, not positive good, but right. It is a positive inflation because it's accompanied by reasonably healthy growth. There's another side to that, though, which nobody ever talks about because we haven't seen this. At least we haven't seen it. Mm-hmm. And that's what we have right now. We have a weak economy and very extraordinary money supply growth. And that's we have a very low turnover, and the low velocity is something that also can give you inflation. You have too much money chasing too few goods. And that's where you get a hyperinflation, as you saw in the Weimar Republic or Zimbabwe. So that's where the risk is that we're going to be. Watch the inflation. If this keeps rising, they don't bring it down fairly soon. I'd fasten my seatbelt because it may get a little volatile. And in any case, the average person can protect himself or herself by owning physical gold or silver, the precious metals. Their historical store of wealth against bad inflation. It's worked over the millennia. My numbers show that it's still in place, even though the government has played with its numbers. If you put your money in gold, you still have what you had before they started cutting back on paying you your cost of living adjustment. It's And in terms of type of gold or silver to hold, I look for physical possession. I think generally holding a common coin, a currency coin, gold or silver, as opposed to one with a high numismatic value. I mean, that's something if you're a coin collector, but if we're heading into hyperinflation, you could end up in a barter situation. And in that type of a circumstance, having some small silver coins for barter, as well as the gold coins, works because they'll be worth a lot more in purchasing power. They'll be worth a lot more than you can imagine right now, and that's just something to consider going forward.
Do you anticipate a barter system? I know we touched on hyperinflation, and then
if we get to a hyperinflation, yes, that's generally where you head, because the currency per se becomes worthless. Right. You have an example. I knew people who lived through the Weimar Republic, or whose parents did, and the stories are extraordinary. As it was getting bad, you wanted to go out to dinner. You'd go into a nice restaurant. You'd negotiate the price of your dinner and sit down and have your dinner, because if you negotiated after dinner, it would cost you more. You could have a wonderful bottle of wine that night. The next morning, that empty scrap bottle of glass was worth more than it was the night before, filled with the wine. I mean, you see that circumstance, you're in the hyperinflation. It devolved into a barter circumstance. You saw the ways one fellow described it was, and that's through connection of some people I know out here at Berkeley who lived through it. Mm-hmm. One morning, the shelves were just empty. It came with very little warning, and then once the shelves were empty, then you were in the barter circumstance. One fellow I knew, his father had traded his shirt for a can of beans for family dinner. He got home and they opened the can of beans, and the beans had gone bad. So it's, even that doesn't work as well as you might like, but something, you can trade your shirt, but if you have a silver quarter, you could trade that as well, and probably get a beefsteak if someone's cutting up a cow. You might be trading with a farmer or such, but you have to consider your circumstances as to how you handle something like that. Very unstable times.
Your recommendation for consumers then is physical gold and silver coins.
Yes.
Great.
And hold it. You can say, "Oh boy, wow! Look at the price of gold. I can cash out now, and I'm on top of the world." But unless the inflation has subsided, it continues exponentially, and you'll lose the benefit you have there if you just cash out. If you're holding it to get you through the inflation, right, you'll have a sense when the inflation is under control.
And do you have a forecast for your estimated price of gold based off of all of this?
Say that again.
Do you have like a estimate on your estimated price of gold for 2022?
Do I have a forecast?
Yes.
I view it as being a lot higher, but I can't. Right. I can't tell you. I can't give you a hard number.
Right.
We have the potential of actually being in a hyperinflation before the end of next year. I'm not making that a formal forecast. It depends on a lot of factors. Mm-hmm. Hopefully, it will never happen, but it depends how things evolve. And the way the Fed's operating right now, they're making a lot of noise about raising rates. We're going to raise rates and keep inflation down. The raising rates doesn't help at the moment. What they have to do is cut back the money supply, and they don't want to do that because they have a very dangerous circumstance with the banking system. So we'll see where it goes. We've been through something like this back in the Great Recession. The banking system collapsed. The Fed just flooded the system with liquidity, kept it afloat. We didn't have extraordinarily bad inflation. It was bad, but it was The Fed's functioning here is to keep the banking system afloat. And this was not a normal recession. If this were, again, a normal recession where you had an overheated economy, and they flooded the system with liquidity to get the economy going again. The economy is booming. Inflation picks up. Raising rates works. But that's not the case. We had a pandemic collapse. And in due credit to the Fed, they flooded the system with liquidity to prevent systemic collapse. They were successful. The system is still having a rough time, but it did not collapse. And now they're trying to work out of it, but it's not a regular economy that they can work out with. So raising the rates here, which is how they would have handled it, this was a recession that they'd addressed. And indeed, it ended up as a recession, but it was not. They were not going in there to save a recession. They're going in there to save the system. It's a whole different character, very dangerous circumstance. They know it, and I obviously hope it's going to work out. But I would urge people to have some gold and silver in reserve just in case. It's never going to lose real value for you.
Right. Better to be safe than sorry.
Yeah.
And John, if my listeners wanted to find more about you and True Inflation, where would they find you?
I have a website called shadowstats.com. And always send me an email at johnwilliams@shadowstats.com. Amazing. Always happy to communicate with people.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you so much for having me.
Anytime.